The snow had been falling for 11 days. Beatrice Voss stood in the doorway of a structure she had built with her own hands and looked out at a world that had gone entirely white. The wind moved across the Virginia highlands in long, low sweeps, picking up the surface snow and driving it sideways across the clearing, erasing the tree line, erasing the fence posts, erasing everything that wasn't directly in front of her face. She was 64 years old. Her hands gripping the door frame on both sides were the hands of a woman who had spent the last 19 months lifting things she had no business lifting. The knuckles were swollen in the cold. Two fingers on her right hand had a permanent curve to them now from gripping a pickaxe handle through a Virginia summer. The skin across her palms was hard and ridged, nothing like the hands she had brought to this place in June of the previous year. She did not look at her hands. She looked at the clearing. Behind her, the corridor stretched 25 feet from the cabin's back door to the root cellar hatch, a covered walkway of oak timber and patchwork canvas that should not by any reasonable measure have been standing. It had survived a May storm that took a full-grown pine down across her fence line. It had survived October sleet that glazed every surface on the ridge in an inch of ice. It was surviving this, whatever this was, the worst winter anyone in Denton Hollow could remember in 50 years. The canvas roof was shedding snow the way Silas had always said it would. She thought about that. She thought about Silas often these days in a way she had not allowed herself to think about him when he was alive. Movement at the edge of the clearing, a shape in the white, a figure moving slowly, struggling through drifts that came up to her waist. A woman, and in the woman's arms, wrapped in a blanket that had seen too many winters, a child. The woman stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked at the cabin with the particular expression of someone who has traveled a long way and is no longer sure they have the right to ask for what they came to ask for. She said two words. Bee could not hear them over the wind, but she could read them. Please. Just that. Please. Beatrice Voss stepped back from the doorway and held the door open, and the woman came forward through the snow, and that was the beginning of something that would not end for another 3 weeks. But to understand what Bay had built and why it mattered and what it cost her to build it, you had to go back 19 months. You had to go back to a Tuesday morning in June of 1907 in a courtroom in Alderton, Virginia, and the sound of grown people laughing at a dead man's last wishes. The laughter started before Judge Harlan Pruitt had finished reading. It began at the back of the room where the farmers and the shopkeepers sat, and it moved forward in a wave the way laughter does when it finds something that confirms what people already believed. By the time the judge reached the end of the document, the sound had filled the courtroom completely, the full, unself-conscious laughter of people who had been waiting years for exactly this moment. Bee stood at the front of the room in a dress that belonged to her neighbor's daughter, and shoes that were half a size too small. She was 63 years old, and she had buried her husband 3 years ago in the spring, and she had not slept the night before, and now she stood in a borrowed dress and listened to the whole of Alderton laugh at Silas Voss one final time. Judge Pruitt sat behind the bench with his wire-rimmed spectacles and his expression of careful neutrality, which was the expression of a man who found something funny, but understood that his position required him not to show it entirely. He waited for the noise to settle. When it didn't, he cleared his throat twice and tapped the bench with one finger. The laughter reduced to something more manageable. The judge looked at Bee over his spectacles. The land, he said, consisted of 15 acres in the Denton Hollow Ridge area, described in the deed as rocky highland terrain, together with a cabin structure and a root cellar excavation. All of it conveyed in full to Beatrice Ann Voss, widow. He paused. Was there anyone present who wished to contest the disposition? Nobody spoke. What they did instead was look at her, the farmers and the shopkeepers, and the 3 men from the county assessor's office who had ridden out to Denton Hollow the previous autumn and come back shaking their heads. They looked at her the way people look at something they find equal parts pitiful and entertaining. A 63-year-old woman with no money and no plan, inheriting 15 acres of limestone and a cabin that the county assessor had described in his report as deteriorated beyond reasonable habitation. Silas Voss had bought that land in 1874. He had spent 33 years on it alone, much of the time working on something nobody in the valley had ever fully understood. They called him the Hollow Man. They called him the Ridge Dreamer. They said the isolation had gotten into his head and turned him peculiar. When he died in the spring of 1904, alone in that leaning cabin on the ridge, People nodded and said it was no surprise. The Voss man had always been more interested in the land than in the world, and the land had finally taken him. Now the land belonged to Bee. She stood in her borrowed dress and let the looks wash over her and did not give anyone the satisfaction of seeing what was behind her eyes. What was behind her eyes she would not have been able to explain. Not grief, she had done her grieving for Silas in the years before he died, in the long way a marriage grieves itself when two people love each other but cannot find a common language for it. Not anger, she had moved past anger sometime in the second year after the funeral when anger stopped being useful and became simply heavy. What was behind her eyes was something closer to calculation, the particular arithmetic of a woman who has just been handed the last option available to her and is trying to determine whether it is actually an option at all or simply the appearance of one. She was 63 years old. She had $12 in a handkerchief in her coat pocket. Her son, who was a decent man and genuinely sorry, had a house with 3 rooms and 4 children and a wife who was already stretched beyond what she could carry. Her sister had not answered the last 2 letters. The boarding house in Alderton cost $4 a month, and she had enough for 3 months, and then she did not know what came after 3 months. Silas's land was the arithmetic. That was all it was. Not hope, not courage, just the last column of a calculation that had run out of other numbers. Jonas Pitchford drove her out in his supply wagon on a Wednesday because he was going that direction anyway, and Willa Finch had paid him 60 cents to take her. He did not speak the entire journey, which suited Bee entirely. She sat among the flour sacks with her one proper suitcase and the box of Silas's old books that smelled like pipe tobacco and the particular mustiness of paper that has been kept in a damp place for years, and she watched the road deteriorate. It narrowed first until the branches scraped both sides of the wagon. Then the ruts deepened until she had to grip the sideboard to keep from being thrown. The air changed as they climbed colder and damper, heavy with pine and the wet smell of earth that never quite dried out at this elevation. A hawk screamed somewhere in the canopy above, and the sound of it bounced off the trees and came back changed. When Jonas pulled up at the edge of the clearing and pointed with his chin, Bee understood for the first time why the courtroom had found the inheritance funny. The cabin sat on a slight rise. From where she stood, she could count 4 places where the roof had failed completely. The boards collapsed inward, the gap open to whatever the sky chose to send through. The whole structure leaned east the way a person leans when they have been fighting the wind for a very long time and have finally accepted that the wind is going to win. Weeds grew waist-high around the foundation. The porch sagged at its center like a broken spine. One support post had rotted through at the base, and the overhang above it hung at an angle that made the whole front of the building look like a face with one side lower than the other. "That's it," she said, not a question. She already knew. Jonas clicked his tongue at the mules, waited until she had climbed down with her suitcase and her box of books, and drove away without a word. She stood in the clearing and watched the wagon disappear around the bend in the road. The sound of the wheels faded. The wind moved through the treetops. A branch fell somewhere in the woods to the east, a soft crashing sound that ended in silence. She was 63 years old, alone on a ridge in the Virginia Highlands, and the thing in front of her was all she had. She made herself walk toward it. The porch steps groaned under her weight. The door required lifting and pushing simultaneously. Inside was worse than the outside had suggested. The dirt floor held a layer of dead leaves and mouse droppings. A rough table sat in the center of the room with 2 dirty tin cups still on its surface, as if someone had simply walked away from a conversation and never come back. The fireplace held a single charred log and a cone of ash that had spread across the hearthstones. A tin of flour on the shelf had gone to mold. The bed in the corner was a narrow iron frame with a straw mattress that had been worked through by something a colony of mice or a family of squirrels, or simply time, and a calico quilt lay across it with the particular water stains of something that has been wet and dried many times without ever being properly washed. As she stood in the doorway taking stock of her inheritance, a drop of snowmelt from the roof above fell onto the quilt. Then another in a steady, quiet rhythm. She did not cry. She was too tired and too cold and too far past the point where crying would have been useful. She just stood there and did the arithmetic again, and the arithmetic came out the same. This was what she had. She spent the first hour moving dead leaves out the door with a piece of broken board. The second hour she spent on her knees scrubbing mouse droppings from the table with water she had hauled from a spring behind the cabin water so cold it took the feeling from her fingers in under a minute. By the time the light started to thin toward evening, she had cleared enough space on the bed to sit without touching anything she preferred not to touch. She had no food. The firewood she could find was rotten. The spring water was clean but cold. And cold water on an empty stomach in an unheated cabin in early June in the Virginia Highlands was a particular kind of miserable. That was when Willa Finch knocked. She was a small, angular woman of perhaps 70, with a face that had been weathered into something that expressed disapproval as its default condition. She wore a dark dress and carried a basket, and she set the basket on the table without being invited and announced that it contained cornbread and a jar of preserves, and that this was Christian duty and not charity, and that there was a meaningful difference between the two. She looked around the cabin with the comprehensive assessment of someone who had seen it before. She said Silas Voss was a decent man and a bad farmer and a fool of the first order. She said this land had driven him strange, the way this particular ridge drove men strange when they stayed on it long enough without results to show. She said the cabin was worse than it looked from outside, and it looked bad enough from outside, and a woman of Bee's age had no business trying to winter here alone. Then she looked at Bee directly. The root cellar, Willa Finch said, hadn't been opened in 3 years. The door hinge had rusted through and the whole thing was half buried in mud. Whatever Silas had been building out there that covered walkway structure, he'd been talking about for 30 years. It existed only in his notebooks and in his head, which was more or less the same thing as not existing at all. She said, go back to Alderton. Find your son, find your sister, find whoever would take a woman in her situation, because her situation was not one that improved on its own. She picked up her empty basket, walked to the door and paused. They will find your bones in the spring, she said, and I will feel sorry for you, but I will not be surprised. She left. Bee sat on the edge of the cleared table and listened to the footsteps recede down the path. Then she opened the basket and found the cornbread and the jar of wild plum preserves, and she ate standing up at the table looking at the wall. She found the root cellar in the morning. She had slept badly the cold, working through the calico quilt and the thin straw mattress, and into her bones the way cold does when you are past 60 and the insulation of youth has gone. She was awake before the light was full. She dressed in everything she owned that would layer, and she went outside. The cellar entrance was where Willa Finch had said it was, at the base of the slope, behind the cabin, half buried in 3 years of leaf fall and mud and the general accumulation of neglect. The oak hatch door was almost horizontal, set into the hillside at a low angle, and the single remaining hinge had gone to rust so complete it had become something else, a geological formation rather than a mechanism. The hasp was fused shut. She spent an hour with a flat rock chipping at the rust, working the hasp back and forth until something gave, with a sound like an old wound reopening. She pulled the door up and back. The smell that came up was cold and deep and entirely without rot. Not the smell of something dead or abandoned, the smell of earth that had been undisturbed long enough to become purely itself. She found a lantern in the cabin and enough kerosene in a jug behind the door to fill it, and she lit it and carried it to the cellar entrance and descended. 23 steps cut directly into the hillside, each one a single flat stone pressed into the earth. She counted them without deciding, to the way you count things when you are paying very close attention to what you are about to encounter. At the bottom, the cellar opened. She had expected a low, cramped space, the kind of root cellar that was more tunnel than room, something you entered at a crouch and left as quickly as possible. What she found was different. The ceiling came to within 6 inches of the top of her head when she stood straight. The chamber extended perhaps 20 feet to either side and 30 feet deep into the hillside. The walls were stone and packed earth, and the floor was flat and dry. And it was warm, not warm the way a heated room is warm, but noticeably, unmistakably, significantly warmer than the June morning outside, warmer than the cabin above, warmer than anything she had expected to find this far underground. She held her hand against the nearest wall and felt what her hand found there. Heat, faint, patient, entirely steady. The deep warmth of earth that has been accumulating the sun's energy for 10,000 years and holds it down in the dark where weather cannot reach it. She stood there with her hand flat against the stone wall for a long time. Along the far wall, she found what she had not known to look for. 27 pieces of oak timber, each one roughly 8 feet long and 4 inches square, cut and planed and stacked in careful order, elevated off the floor on flat stones to keep the moisture away from the wood. They had been there for years. The canvas that had wrapped them had deteriorated to fragments, but the wood itself was solid, properly cured, no warp, no rot. Silas had cut and prepared the framing lumber for the quarter. He had carried it down here and stored it, waiting until he had everything else he needed to begin. He had not lived long enough to begin. She was still standing at the wall of stacked lumber, calculating weights and distances in a way she had never calculated anything before, when her boot came down on a stone that moved. It was a flat piece of limestone, perhaps a foot square, set into the floor near the base of the lumber stack. Every other stone on the floor was packed solid, fixed by decades of weight and damp. This one shifted when she pressed it, a slight but unmistakable rocking motion. She knelt, got her fingers around the edge, lifted. Beneath the stone was a hollow in the earth, roughly 2 feet deep, lined with flat rocks around its walls. Inside the hollow were 5 leather-bound notebooks wrapped in oilcloth that had been wrapped in turn in a length of canvas, the layers kept mostly intact. Beside the notebooks, sealed carefully in a separate piece of oilcloth, was a single envelope. Her name was written on the front in Silas's handwriting. Not Beatrice, not Mrs. Voss, just B. She sat down on the cold floor with the lantern beside her. She looked at the envelope for a long time before she opened it. The letter was 2 pages, both sides written in the careful handwriting of a man who had thought about every word before committing it to paper. He did not begin with an apology. He did not begin with explanation. He began the way Silas had always begun things, with the fact of what was true. B, he wrote, I know you have never believed in what I was doing out here. I know you thought I had lost my sense of proportion, and I know there were times when you were ashamed of how people talked about me, and I want you to know that I understood that even when it hurt. I understood it because you were not wrong to want a husband who made sense to the world. I was not always able to be that husband. But I need to ask you one thing. Before you decide to sell this land, before you make any arrangement you cannot undo, I am asking you to read the first notebook. Not all 5, just the first one. Read it from the beginning to the end, and then make whatever decision seems right to you. That is all I am asking, one notebook. After that, you owe me nothing. She read the letter twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it back in the oilcloth. She gathered all 5 notebooks and carried them up the 23 steps and across the clearing to the cabin. The June evening came on slowly, the way evenings do in the Virginia Highlands, the light lasting longer than you expect it to. She lit the candle stub she found in a drawer, wrapped herself in the calico quilt despite its water stains, and opened the first notebook. The handwriting was the same careful script as the letter, and she recognized it the way you recognize a voice you have not heard in years. The same hand that had written grocery lists on the back of seed catalogs. The same hand that had signed the land deed in 1874. The same hand that had once, a long time before things became what they became, written her a letter that she had kept in a box under her bed for 20 years before she lost it in one of the moves. The first entry was dated June of 1874. He had bought the land on a Tuesday. He had walked every acre in the first week, counting his steps, recording what he found. The soil composition, the rock formations, the angle of the slope, the elevation, the way the wind moved across the ridge at different times of day and in different seasons, which he had observed by returning to the same spots over many months before he wrote anything down. He was not, she understood within the first 20 pages, a man who wrote things down carelessly. The root cellar had been excavated in the autumn of 1876. 2 years of planning before he broke ground. He had chosen the site based on calculations about the water table and the composition of the hillside and the angle that would maximize thermal stability while minimizing the risk of collapse. He had drilled a small hole in the cellar door and hung a thermometer inside, and for the next 3 years, he had recorded the temperature every single day. June 45 degrees, August 45 degrees, November 45 degrees, February 45 degrees. The notation that he underlined 6 times with a straight edge was this: the earth does not know how to give up its heat. It simply holds year after year, patient as anything in nature has ever been. We do not need to heat the cellar. We need only to reach it. She read until the candle burned down to its last inch. She found another in the drawer and lit that one from the first. She read until the second candle guttered. In the dark, she sat with the closed notebook pressed against the front of her coat and listened to the night sounds of the ridge, the wind in the pines, something moving in the brush to the east, something small and unhurried. The creek at the base of the hollow, barely audible at this distance, but present a continuous sound underneath all the other sounds. She thought about what she had read, 33 years of observation, 33 years of measurements and calculations and failures and adjustments and more measurements. Not the ravings of a man who had lost his reason, the systematic record of a man who had understood something that no one else in the valley had bothered to understand, and who had spent 3 decades trying to build a practical application for that understanding. The corridor, a covered walkway properly framed and insulated connecting the cabin to the cellar entrance. A structure that would make the cellar accessible regardless of what winter delivered. A bridge between the warmth underground and the people who needed it above. He had the design. He had the lumber cut and stored. He had 33 years of data that said it would work. He had simply run out of time before he could put it together. She sat in the dark for a long time. Then she said out loud to no one, to the dark cabin, and the calico quilt, and the notebook in her hands, and the man who was 3 years in the ground on the other side of the clearing. All right, Silas, show me how. In the morning, she went back down to the cellar. She stood at the lumber stack and ran her hand along the top piece of oak, feeling the grain, feeling the weight of it, feeling what 33 years of patient preparation felt like in physical terms. 8 feet long, 4 inches square, dry and solid and ready. She picked up one end of the top piece and felt how heavy it was. Her hands ached already. Her back was not what it had been at 40 or 50 or even 60. She was 63 years old, and she had not done significant physical labor in years, and every joint in her body had an opinion about the oak timber in her hands. She set the timber down. She picked it up again. She carried it up the 23 steps and out into the morning light and set it down beside the cabin's back door, exactly where the first post would need to be, according to the diagram she had memorized from the second page of Silas's first notebook. Then she went back down for the second piece. It took her most of the morning to move all 27 pieces of lumber from the cellar to the building site behind the cabin. By the time she was done, her shoulders were burning in a way that said something specific about what tomorrow morning was going to feel like. Her hands had blisters on both palms from the friction of rough wood against soft skin. She stood in the morning light with her hands at her sides and looked at the lumber arranged on the ground exactly where Silas's plan said it needed to be, and she thought about what came next. 12 post holes, 4 feet deep each below the frost line, because Silas's notebook was explicit about what happened to posts that didn't go below the frost line in a Virginia Highland winter. She did not own a pickaxe. She walked the 2 miles to Willa Finch's farm, which was the closest neighbor, and knocked on the door. Willa Finch opened it and looked at her without expression. I need to borrow a pickaxe, Bee said, and a hammer, and whatever nails you can spare. I will return them when I am finished. Willa Finch looked at her for a long moment. She said, I will lend you the tools in exchange for cleaning out the chicken coop, which needed doing since last autumn, and she had not gotten to it. Bee cleaned the chicken coop. It took most of the afternoon. When she left with the pickaxe over one shoulder and the hammer and a coffee tin of nails in her other hand, Willa Finch watched her go from the doorway with an expression that contained something Bee could not quite name. Not pity, not quite respect. Something in between. Something that said, I have seen this before. I have seen people decide things on this ridge. I have seen how it ends. Bee walked back up the path toward the cabin as the light went gold through the trees, the pickaxe on her shoulder, the borrowed tools in her hand. 12 post holes, 4 feet deep, beginning in the morning. She was 63 years old and her hands already hurt, and the summer was not going to last forever. And she had exactly one notebook's worth of understanding and one dead man's 33 years of preparation and nothing else. It was, she had decided somewhere on the walk back enough to begin. The first post hole took most of a day. Bee was on her knees in the dirt behind the cabin. At first light, the pickaxe raised over her right shoulder, and she brought it down into the Virginia clay with everything she had. The blade went in 2 inches. She worked it loose and raised it again. 2 more inches. The clay here was dense and cold, packed by decades of frost and thaw, into something that was less like soil and more like compressed time, layer after layer of seasons pressed together until they had become almost stone. By mid-morning, she had gone down 18 inches. She stopped and stretched her back, both hands pressing against the base of her spine, and looked up at the sky through the tree canopy. The light was moving. The summer was moving. She had 12 holes to dig before she could set a single post, and the first hole was not yet half done, and her hands were already communicating things to her that she did not want to hear. She had found in Silas's notebook a diagram she had studied until she could close her eyes and see it clearly. 12 posts, each one set 4 feet into the earth, forming 2 parallel rows that ran from the cabin's back door to the cellar hatch. The posts would carry the cross beams. The cross beams would carry the roof framing would carry the canvas, and the canvas, treated with linseed oil and tied down at the base of each post, would carry the weight of whatever Winter chose to put on top of it. 4 feet down, the notebook said, Silas had underlined it twice, below the frost line. If the post heave, the roof follows. She went back to digging. By the time the light went low through the trees, she had one post hole at 4 feet and hands that were blistered through in both palms, the skin broken and weeping in 3 places. She wrapped them in strips torn from the hem of her oldest petticoat, the one that was beyond mending, and she went inside and made a meal from the last of the cornbread and a handful of dried beans she had soaked overnight, and she sat at the rough table in the failing light and opened the second notebook. Silas had failed at this exact stage 20 years before. He had dug the first 3 post holes in the summer of 1887, he wrote, and then a drought had arrived, and the well had dropped, and the garden had needed everything she had, and by the time the drought broke, it was September and too close to frost to set posts safely. And so he had waited until the following year. The following year, his back had gone out in April and kept him from heavy work until June, and by June, the garden always something. He did not write this with self-pity. He wrote it the way a man writes a field report, noting the obstacle and the outcome and what he had understood from it. But between the lines of careful notation, between the measurements and the dates, B heard something she recognized. The specific exhaustion of a person who has been working towards something for so long that the working has become indistinguishable from the thing itself, where you could no longer tell whether you believed in the destination or simply in the motion. She closed the notebook. In the morning, she went back to digging. The second hole went faster, the third faster still. Her hands had formed something in the first week that was neither quite blister nor quite callous, a transitional hardness that hurt differently than the original skin, had hurt deeper and more structural, the pain of the body reorganizing itself around the demands being placed on it. By the end of the second week, the skin across her palms had gone yellow and hard in the places where the pickaxe handle rested, and her grip had changed, the fingers finding the wood with a familiarity they had not possessed before. She ate what the press gave her: wild ramps in the low spots near the creek, a handful of early service berries, dandelion greens boiled with a small piece of salt pork she had bought in Alderton before she left, rationing it to a sliver per pot. She was losing weight she could not afford to lose, and she knew it, and she ate anyway, because the alternative was not eating, and not eating was not an option while there were post holes to dig. On the 12th day, Willa Finch appeared at the edge of the clearing. She stood there without calling out, watching B work the 4th post hole with the unhurried attention of someone who has come to see something specific and intends to see all of it. When B straightened and looked at her, Willa held up a cloth-covered bowl without expression. She crossed the clearing, set the bowl on the porch step, and turned to leave. "Chicken soup," she said, without looking back. The hen was old and not laying. She did not wait for thanks. She walked back down the path and disappeared around the bend, and B sat on the porch step and ate the soup directly from the bowl with a piece of hard cornbread she had been saving, and it was the best thing she had tasted since she arrived on the ridge. She did not understand Willa Finch, and she was not sure she needed to. By the end of July, she had all 12 holes at depth. She set the posts herself one at a time, tamping the earth back around each base in careful layers, the way Silas's notebook described using a heavy river stone she had dragged up from the creek bed to tamp each layer down before adding the next. The work was slower than digging. It required precision that the digging had not required. The post had to be plumb, had to be exactly vertical in both planes, and checking it meant stepping back and sighting along it, and then adjusting and checking again, a process that took as long as an hour for a single post when the ground was uneven beneath it. She made mistakes. She reset 2 posts after deciding they were not quite right, pulling them back out of the ground she had just packed and starting over because Silas's notebook was clear about what a post that was half a degree off would do to the roof load by the time winter came. She did not resent the extra work. She was beyond resentment by then. She was simply a person doing a specific thing, and the thing required what it required. By the end of July, she had all 12 posts standing, and the ridge line of the structure was visible for the first time, the 2 parallel rows of oak rising from the cleared ground behind the cabin, forming the shape of what would eventually be a roofed corridor. She stood back and looked at it from the cabin doorway. It was not much. It was 12 posts in the ground, nothing more. But they were straight, and they were solid, and they were hers. And she had put them there with hands that had never done this kind of work before, and a body that had spent the first 63 years of its life doing entirely different things. She went inside and opened the third notebook and read until the light was gone. The storm arrived on the second day of August without meaningful warning. She woke to the sound of it, a pressure change that had worked its way into her sleep and converted itself to urgency before she was fully conscious. By the time she was on her feet and at the door, the sky to the west was the color of a wound, deep purple and green at the horizon, the clouds rolling against each other with a violence that had no place in an early August morning. She got the cabin door secured. She brought in everything she had left outside. She stood at the window and watched the sky move and thought about the posts. The wind hit at mid-morning. Not the steady wind she had learned to live with on the ridge, the constant southwest flow that bent the grass and moved through the pines with a sound like breathing. This was different, directional, and sudden, coming from the northwest in hard gusts that hit the ridge like something thrown rather than something flowing. The pines bent at angles they were not built for. Dead branches came down across the clearing. Through the cabin's one intact window, she watched the posts. 11 of them held without visible movement, the earth around their bases packed tight enough that the wind found nothing to work with. The fourth post from the cabin, the one she had been most satisfied with because it had gone in perfectly plumb, on the first try began to move in the second hour of the storm. It was not a large movement. Not at first. A slight oscillation at the top, barely visible, a trembling that could have been the light playing tricks through the rain-streaked window glass. She pressed her face to the glass and watched it. The oscillation became a lean. The lean became a progressive failure. The break happened about 3 feet from the top, where a flaw in the wood that she had not detected when she selected the post had been waiting for exactly the right combination of force and leverage. The upper section went sideways in a single motion, not falling but flying, caught by the wind, and carried 5 feet across the clearing before it came to rest in the wet grass. She stood at the window and looked at the gap in the row of posts where post number 4 had been. The rain came harder. The remaining post stood. She went to the bed and sat down on the edge of it, and she put her hands on her knees and she looked at the floor. One post. She had lost 1 post out of 12, and she could not replace it because the lumber Silas had left in the cellar was accounted for down to the last piece. And buying new timber meant a trip to Alderton and money she did not have, and time she could not spare, with August already started and autumn coming behind it, at the speed it always came in the Virginia Highlands, faster than you expected, and less forgiving than you remembered. She sat there for a while with the storm outside and the silence inside, which was not really silence, but the sound of everything she had built in the last 2 months being reduced in value by a single piece of oak with a flaw she should have found. She reached for the nearest notebook without deciding to. It happened the way some things happen when you are not actively in charge of yourself, the hand finding what the mind needs before the mind has formed the thought. The page she opened to was dated August of 1892. Silas would have been somewhere around 60, then older than she was now, still working the ridge, still building towards something the valley had long since stopped expecting him to finish. His handwriting on this page was different from the careful notation of the earlier entries. Faster, less controlled at the edges. Lost the north wall today, he had written. The storm took it clean. I have been sitting here for an hour trying to decide what this means. Marion thinks it is God telling me to stop. Maybe it is. But I have been thinking about signs, and here is what I believe. The wind taking down my wall is not God telling me to quit. It is God asking me a question. What are you going to do next? That is the only question worth answering. Everything else is just weather. She read the passage twice. Then she closed the notebook, set it on the table, and went to the door. The storm was still going. The rain was coming sideways across the clearing, and the wind was cold despite the August date, and everything outside was wet and gray and moving. She looked at the gap where post number 4 had been. Then she looked at the lean-to structure on the east side of the cabin, the small shed Silas had used for storing tools which she had been using for the same purpose. The shed had a single support post at its outer corner, a piece of oak roughly the right dimensions set into the ground, but not carrying significant load because the shed roof was light and narrow. She could pull that post. It would leave the shed roof unsupported on one corner, but the shed roof was not critical. The corridor was critical. She went back to work in the rain. Emmett Greer came on an afternoon in the middle of August, on a day when the air smelled like autumn for the first time, that particular sharpness that arrives in the Virginia highlands without announcement and means that September is serious about coming. She heard the walking stick before she saw him, a steady tap on the path, irregular enough to indicate a limp, and then the man himself came into the clearing from the south path, not the road path, the one that came up from the creek hollow where the old Greer farm sat in the bottomland. He was 79 years old and looked every year of it, stooped forward at the shoulders in the way of men whose backs have made a separate peace with gravity. His beard had gone entirely white. His hands on the walking stick were enlarged at the knuckles in the way of hands that had done hard work for a long time and then stopped being able to do it and had not accepted this gracefully. He wore a faded work shirt and trousers held by rope, and he moved across the clearing with the deliberate economy of someone who has learned that each step is a negotiation. He did not call out. He came to the edge of the building site and looked at the posts and the cross beams she had been fitting for the last week, and he looked at them for a long time without saying anything. Then he raised his walking stick and pointed to the third cross beam from the cellar end. That one, he said, is bearing wrong. She looked at where he was pointing. The weight is distributed to the outside of the post cap instead of the center. He spoke without looking at her, still examining the structure. Come February, it will shift. When it shifts, it will take the two adjacent beams with it. She looked at the beam. She could see now that he had named it exactly what he meant. The slight irregularity in how the beam sat in the post cap, the weight going to the wrong edge by perhaps 3/4 of an inch. 3/4 of an inch, that would become 2 inches under a snow load. 2 inches, that would become a collapse. She looked at the man who had found this in 30 seconds of looking. Who are you? She said. Emmett Greer. He finally looked at her pale blue eyes that had faded at the edges but not in the center. I knew your husband. We worked together some back before his back gave out. She had never heard Silas mention an Emmett Greer. He built things, Emmett said. He built things, and he talked about this corridor for 15 years before I stopped listening, and another 10 years after that. He paused. I came to see if you were actually building it. She waited. The eastern post second from the cabin, he said, pointing again. It's leaning a 1/4 inch toward the cellar. That's not much now. She said it will be an inch by December. He looked at her. It will be an inch by December, she said. I read the notebooks. Something shifted in Emmett Greer's face. Not surprise exactly. More like confirmation of a thing he had been uncertain about and was now certain of. He walked to the nearest stump at the edge of the clearing, moving carefully over the uneven ground, and he sat down with the deliberate relief of a man who has been standing longer than he should have been. Show me, he said, what you've got. She showed him everything. The posts spacing the crossbeam, notching the canvas attachment system she had planned, the drainage she had cut along the base of the corridor to keep rainwater from undermining the post footings. She showed him Silas's diagram from the notebook, the cross-section showing the roof angle and the canvas pitch. Emmett listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions, both of them technical, both of them pointing to the same thing: the weakest load-bearing junction in the design, the place where the roof framing met the wall posts in bad weather. Your husband understood the theory, Emmett said when she finished. He was right about the thermal mass, right about the corridor concept, right about the canvas treatment. He looked at the structure. He wasn't a builder, though, not by trade. There are things here a builder would have done differently. He picked up a stick from the ground and drew in the dirt. The junction she had been worrying about, sketched from the outside, and then from above, the load paths visible in the drawing in a way they had not been visible to her before. Iron brackets, he said. Old barn hardware if you can find it. Set at this angle. He drew the angle. You carry the load down through the post instead of across the beam joint. The joint becomes a connection instead of a support. He looked up. Can you drive nails? I've been driving nails for 2 months, she said. He almost smiled. I can't do much physical work, he said. My back has been finished since winter before last, and this, he tapped his chest with 2 fingers, doesn't work the way it should. But I can tell you where every nail needs to go and why. I can tell you which wood to trust and which to be suspicious of. He paused. I can teach you what 40 years of building taught me. He looked at the corridor post standing in the August afternoon. Silas talked about this for 20 years, he said. I should have listened sooner. He stayed for dinner that evening. She had little enough to offer, boiled greens and a few of the small, knobby potatoes that had appeared beside the cellar door in June, the descendants of something Silas had planted years before still producing in the disturbed earth. Emmett ate like a man who had not had company at a meal in a long time, which she suspected was true. He talked about Silas, not the Silas who had been called the Hollow Man in The Ridge Dreamer, the Silas who had appeared at Emmett's door in the middle of January in 1895, when the snow was hip-deep in the hollow, and Emmett's wife had been dead for 6 months, and Emmett had been sitting in the dark letting the fire go out. He brought soup, Emmett said. A whole pot of it carried 2 miles through the snow. And then he sat down at my table and started talking about the root cellar, about the thermal mass, about this corridor he'd been planning since 1880. He talked for 3 hours without stopping. I was so irritated by the time he left that I went to his place the next day just to argue with him. He looked at his bowl. We were friends for 9 years after that, until his back made the walking too difficult. He said it simply, without sentimentality, the way men of his generation spoke about things that had mattered. Silas didn't come to save you, B said. No, Emmett looked at the table. He came because he needed someone to talk to about the corridor. He paused, but it came to the same thing. She sat with that for a moment. He wasn't just building a walkway, she said. Emmett looked up. He was never just building a walkway, Emmett said. September came in with color and cold, the maples on the south-facing slopes going first orange and red against the still green pine. The cross beams were up by the second week of September, the corrected junction at each post, carrying the low load, the way Emmett had drawn it in the dirt. The iron brackets salvaged from the collapsed shed behind his farm, bent back to true with a hammer and reset in the new positions. B had walked the 2 miles to his place 3 times to collect hardware and advice, and each time she came back, she understood more of what she was building. The canvas was the problem she had been circling since June. Proper sailcloth cost more money than she had ever held at one time. A single bolt of the treated canvas that Silas's notebook called for would run to $1.50 per yard at the dry goods store in Alderton. And she needed at least 40 yards, and 40 times $1.50 was a number that might as well have been written in a foreign language. Roscoe Briggs kept his dry goods store on the main street of Alderton, and he had been in the courtroom on the Tuesday in June when Judge Pruitt read the will, and he had been among the ones who laughed. She went to see him on a Thursday in mid-September carrying a basket of potatoes from the volunteer plants beside the cellar door, 10 pounds of small, clean, firm potatoes that she had washed and sorted by size. She set the basket on his counter. He looked at the potatoes and then at her. His expression said several things without saying any of them aloud. I need flour sacks, she said. The large ones. As many as you'll give me for the potatoes. He picked up one of the potatoes and turned it in his hands. It was a good potato. She had made sure of that. Where'd you grow these, he said. On the ridge. He set the potato down. He looked at her with the expression of a man who was revising a calculation he thought he had completed. He gave her 6 sacks. It wasn't enough. She needed 15 at minimum 20 to do the job properly, and 6 sacks was barely a start. But it was a start. She cleaned Willa Finch's chicken coop a second time in exchange for 2 more sacks. She repaired a section of fence for a farmer named Aldous Weir on the road south of Alderton and received 1 sack and a small jar of lard. She found 3 more sacks in the cellar itself, buried under the deteriorated original canvas, musty but intact. She pulled apart 2 worn-out burlap grain sacks she found in the cabin and added the fabric to the total. By the 1st of October, she had enough. She cut the sacks to size on the cabin floor, fitting the pieces to the template she had made from Silas's diagram. She sewed the seams with thread she had unraveled from an old wool shirt, doubled and tripled at the stress points where the canvas would take the most wind load. Then she heated linseed oil in a pot over the cabin fire and applied it with a rag, working it into every inch of the patchwork fabric until the cloth was saturated and dark and translucent at the edges. The smell was terrible. Her eyes watered from across the room. Her hands turned slick and yellow and stayed that way for 3 days. When she stretched the treated canvas over the frame and began tying it down at the base of each post, she found that it held tension the way it was supposed to hold it. Not pretty, not uniform, the patchwork visible in the different weights and weaves of the different fabrics, a dozen shades of off-white and gray and cream, but tight, taut in the way of something that has been properly tensioned, that does not flutter or sag or find places to let the wind through. She tied the last base tie at dusk on the 14th of October. She stood at the cabin door and looked down the length of the corridor. 25 feet of covered walkway timber and patchwork canvas running from where she stood to the cellar hatch at the far end. The interior was dim, but not dark, the treated canvas letting through a diffused light that was gray and even. The air inside was still, no wind. The October evening was moving the treetops at the edge of the clearing, and she could hear it, but inside the corridor, she could not feel it. She walked its length. Her footsteps on the packed earth floor made a contained sound close and clear, the sound of a person walking through a space that had walls and a roof that was separate from the weather. At the cellar end, the temperature dropped noticeably as she neared the hatch door, the cold of the earth coming up to meet the air of the corridor and the corridor holding that meeting containing it. She knelt and opened the cellar hatch. The warmth came up as it always came up, 45 degrees of patient earth warmth, rising into the October air. She took the lantern from the hook beside the hatch and descended. The crates of seeds she had planted 3 weeks before sat along the back wall. 3 wooden boxes salvaged from behind Roscoe Briggs' store filled with dark soil she had carried from the low spot near the spring where the earth was richest. She had planted carrot seed in all 3, purchased with the last 40 cents she had to her name, because Silas's notebook was specific about what thrived in cellar conditions and what did not, and carrots were the first thing on his list. She held the lantern over the nearest crate and leaned in close. She had been down to check every day for 3 weeks, and every day there had been nothing, just dark soil and patience, and she had been telling herself each evening that the conditions were right and the timing was correct, and that Silas's notebook said this was how it worked, and she had no reason to doubt the notebook. On the 24th day she found them, 17 threads of green barely visible in the lantern light, each one a fraction of an inch tall, pressed up through the dark soil with the particular determination of things that have decided to exist despite the available evidence. Carrot sprouts. Underground. In October, when every garden in Denton Hollow had been dead for 3 weeks. She sat back on her heels and looked at them for a long time. They will tell you nothing grows in the cold dark, Silas had written in the 5th notebook in the winter of 1903, 2 years before he died. They never kept a lantern inside. She whispered the words in the cellar light, her voice catching at the last syllable. Then she heard footsteps on the cellar stairs. Ida Marsh came down carefully, holding the wall with one hand. She was a woman of perhaps 45, angular and composed, wearing a traveling coat that had seen considerable use and carrying a leather satchel over one shoulder. She had the particular bearing of someone educated beyond what the valley expected, which in Ida Marsh's case was considerably beyond. She was the school teacher in Alderton. She was also, as B.A. would learn in the next half hour, a correspondent for the Virginia State Agricultural Bulletin, and she had heard about the corridor from Willa Finch, who had apparently described it to 3 different people at the general store with an expression that Ida Marsh could only characterize as reluctant admiration. She stood at the bottom of the cellar stairs and looked at the crates of carrot sprouts in the lantern light, and she was quiet for long enough that B had time to study her face. What Ida Marsh's face showed was not the expression of someone seeing a curiosity. It was the expression of someone seeing a confirmation of something they had been thinking about for a long time. She asked precise questions: the depth of the cellar, the composition of the walls, the temperature gradient between the corridor and the cellar interior, how B had treated the canvas, the angle of the corridor roof and why that angle specifically. B answered everything. At the end, Ida Marsh opened her leather satchel and took out a small notebook, and she looked at B over the top of it. Are you aware, she said, that what you have built here is a practical demonstration of principles that agricultural researchers at the university have been arguing about in theory for 20 years? Obey said. She paused. I knew it worked. Silas's data said it would work. Ida Marsh wrote something. Then she looked up. I would like to write about this for the bulletin, she said, with your permission. I think people in every county in the state should know what has been done on this ridge. B thought about the courtroom in June and the judge's wire-rimmed spectacles and the sound of grown people finding something to laugh at. She thought about a man who had spent 33 years working towards something in a valley that had never believed in him. One condition, she said. Ida Marsh waited. Silas Voss's name, Bewey said. It goes before mine. First in the article and larger if there's a choice about the size of the type. 33 years of his work is what made this possible. I built it, but he understood it. There is a difference, and I want the difference to be clear. Ida Marsh looked at her for a moment. Then she wrote something in her notebook, unhurried and deliberate. That is exactly right, she said, and I will say so plainly. She stayed for an hour asking questions and writing, examining the corridor frame from the inside and the outside, pressing her hand against the canvas the way B had seen Emmett press his hand against the post joints, feeling for the thing beneath the surface. At the cellar hatch before she left, Ida Marsh paused. Your grandfather would be proud, she said. He was my husband, Bea said. Ida Marsh's expression changed slightly. I beg your pardon. Your husband, she said. He would be proud. Bea looked at the cellar hatch, at the warmth rising through the opening from 45 degrees of patient earth below. I hope so, she said. I genuinely hope so. She watched Ida Marsh walk down the corridor and out through the cabin's back door, and then she went back down to the cellar and sat on the floor beside the crates of carrot sprouts and stayed there until the lantern oil ran low, just sitting in the warm dark, listening to the silence of the earth around her. Outside, the October evening was moving through the trees. Inside the corridor, nothing moved at all. She had built what Silas had designed. The lumber he had cut and stored was in the roof framing above her head. The knowledge he had accumulated over 33 years was in the notebooks she had memorized. The warmth he had measured every day for 3 years was rising through the cellar floor and the cellar walls and into the air around her hands. What remained was the winter. The test that everything had been built toward the thing that Silas had known was coming and had been preparing for since 1874, the thing that Emmett Greer had said was the only thing that mattered. She had built the corridor. Now she had to find out if the corridor would hold. She went upstairs through the hatch, along the 25 feet of covered walkway through the cabin's back door, and she sat at the table and opened the 5th notebook to the place she had marked, and she read until the fire died to coals, and the Highland night pressed close against the cabin walls. November was coming. November was always coming. In the Virginia Highlands, with the particular certainty of seasons that do not negotiate and do not arrive late. She closed the notebook and went to sleep. The first sign came on the 18th of January. Bea had learned in 7 months on the ridge to read the sky the way Silas's notebooks had taught her to read everything else, not by looking at what was visible, but by looking at what the visible thing implied. The morning of the 18th was mild. 28 degrees, the air still a thin overcast that gave the light a flat quality without drama. The kind of January morning that presents itself as ordinary and asks you to believe it. She did not believe it. She stood outside the cabin door at first light and looked northwest, which was the direction that mattered in the Virginia Highlands. The horizon there had a quality she had seen described in the 4th notebook, a particular density to the overcast, not the thin gray of ordinary cloud cover, but something with depth and intention behind it, the sky thickening from the outside in. And around the moon, which had set but whose position she had marked at 3 in the morning when she woke. For no reason she could name, there had been a complete ring of diffused light ice crystals in the upper atmosphere, catching and bending the moonlight into a perfect circle. Silas had written about that ring in the winter of 1898. He had devoted 2 pages to it, the atmospheric physics and the folk knowledge, arriving at the same conclusion from different directions. When you see the ring, he wrote, you have perhaps 18 hours. Use them. She used them. She spent the morning carrying water. Every bucket, every pot, every basin she owned filled from the spring and carried inside and set where they would not freeze. The spring itself she covered with the piece of canvas she kept for exactly this purpose, weighted at the edges with stones to slow the surface freezing that would make drawing water impossible in the worst cold. She brought the corridor's canvas ties an extra loop tighter at each post base, working down the line, methodically testing each one with a hard pull before moving to the next. She checked every joint Emmett had shown, her pressing her palm against each iron bracket the way he pressed his palm against things he wanted to understand. She found two ties that had worked slightly loose in the November rains and reset them until the canvas sang under her knuckle when she tapped it. She brought in wood, then more wood, then a quantity of the twisted hay bundles she had been making since October grass from the ridge gathered and twisted into tight cylinders that burned longer and hotter than loose hay, Silas's solution to the fuel problem, in a place where timber was limited and grass was not. Emmett watched all of this from the cabin doorway. He had come down from his place in the hollow 3 days before moving slowly through the January cold with his walking stick in a canvas pack that contained his few necessities. His cough had deepened with the season settling into his chest in a way that was different from the autumn cough lower and wetter, the kind of sound that comes from lungs that have been at this work for nearly 80 years and are beginning to express reservations about continuing. He was too sick to manage the 2 miles back to his farm alone, and they had agreed without discussing it at length because neither of them was inclined to discuss things at length that he would stay. He looked at the sky. This is the one, he said. She did not ask what he meant. She understood what he meant. By noon, the sky to the northwest had begun to move in the way that meant it was serious. Not drifting, not the casual relocation of ordinary weather, but advancing the clouds, building vertically into shapes that had no business forming over flat ground. An anvil formation rising into the upper atmosphere with the purposeful verticality of something that has decided it is done waiting. The south wind, which had been light all morning, died completely at noon. She called inside to Emmett and then went to the lean-to shed and brought the single remaining chicken inside, settling it in a wooden crate near the stove with a handful of cracked corn she had been saving. The cow had died in November, a loss she had not allowed herself to grieve fully because grief cost energy she could not spare. The chicken was what remained, and the chicken was going to survive this winter if she had anything to say about it. At 2 in the afternoon, the temperature had dropped to 18 degrees. At 4, it was snowing. Not the preliminary snow that announces a storm and then pauses while the storm decides what it wants to do. This was the storm itself arriving fully committed, the flakes driving at an angle that said the wind had chosen its direction and intended to keep it. By 6, she could not see the cellar hatch from the cabin window. She went through the corridor to check it. The canvas walls were moving slightly under the wind pressure, a contained trembling that was entirely different from the wild flexion she had feared the structure, absorbing the lateral force and distributing it through the timber frame, the way Emmett's iron brackets were designed to distribute it. The cellar hatch was clear. The roof above it was shedding snow at the angle Silas had calculated the steep pitch, refusing to accumulate any load worth worrying about. She went back through the corridor to the cabin and dropped the latch bar. She built up the fire. She checked the thermometer on the kitchen shelf. 49 degrees. She wrote it in the notebook she had been keeping since November the 6th. Notebook, the one that was hers. Outside, temperature estimated 18. Inside, 49. Fire moderate. Emmett was in the chair by the stove. He looked at what she wrote and nodded once, and neither of them said anything because the numbers said what needed saying. The blizzard arrived before midnight. She knew it had arrived because the sound changed. What had been a hard storm became something that had no useful comparison to the storm she had known before this winter. The wind doubled, then doubled again, and the sound it made against the cabin walls and the corridor canvas was no longer a howl, which implied rhythm and variation, but a sustained note, continuous and enormous, the sound of a thing so large it did not need to modulate itself. She sat beside the stove with the notebook and wrote numbers at the top of every hour. 11 at night, 47 degrees inside. The fire had burned down to a moderate coal bed, and she added 3 twisted hay bundles and watched the temperature recover to 49 within 30 minutes. She cracked the door to read the exterior thermometer, pressing her body against the gap to limit what got through, and the wind hit her face like a physical object. Not the pressure of moving air, but something more solid, ice crystals in such density that they functioned as a surface. She read the number in the 2 seconds she could hold her face in the gap. 14 below zero. She pulled the door closed and latched it and stood for a moment with her back against the wood while the temperature in the room dropped 4 degrees from the 2 seconds of open door and then slowly over the next 20 minutes recovered. She wrote the number. Then she sat down and thought about the Peterson family. She knew the Petersons the way you know people in a small valley by sight and occasion and the things that other people said about them. John Peterson had a claim shanty 3 miles east. Single wall construction, a family of 5, a man who had been planning to build something better for 4 years and had not yet built it. She had seen Edna Peterson at the store in Alderton in November, a brief exchange, the kind that carries the weight of everything neither party says. She did not know what was happening in the Peterson shanty right now. She could not know, and there was nothing she could do about it, and she sat with that knowledge, the way you sit with things that are true and unalterable. She thought about Harold Strand, the bachelor homesteader north of the Hollow, who lived in the old dugout that had belonged to the Erickson family before the Ericksons built the frame house that had not lasted either. Strand had survived 3 Virginia Highland winters in that dugout. A dugout held heat reasonably well. Silas's notebook acknowledged that, but a dugout chimney packed with snow was a different problem. One that had no solution except climbing out into whatever was happening outside and clearing the opening, which in conditions like this was not something a man alone could do safely more than once. She was not in a dugout. She added 2 more hay bundles to the fire and sat back down. Midnight, 47 degrees inside, 31 below zero outside. The walls of the hay bale house that Silas had never built held what they held. The corridor canvas held what it held. The entire structure she had built from a dead man's plans and borrowed tools and patchwork flour sacks was performing in the worst conditions the Virginia Highlands had produced in 50 years, exactly as the 6th notebook's temperature record said it should perform. Emmett was asleep in the chair, his breathing audible in the quiet spaces between gusts, the wet sound of lungs that were doing their work with effort. She watched his chest rise and fall in the firelight and did not disturb him. She opened the 5th notebook to the last entry Silas had written dated November of 1903, 2 years before he died. The handwriting was shakier than the earlier entries, the hand of a man in his 70s who had been out in the cold. Hard night, he had written. The cold gets into the bones and stays. I went down to the cellar this morning and put my hand on the wall, and the stone was warm. 46 degrees, same as yesterday, same as 30 years ago. The earth doesn't know how to give up its warmth. It just holds year after year, patient as anything I have ever known. If the earth can do that, then I suppose I can do it too. She closed the notebook and set it on the table. She thought Silas. The walls are holding, the cellar is holding, 47 degrees inside at 31 below zero, and it is still dropping outside and the corridor has not moved. Can you hear me wherever you are? The thing you spent 33 years trying to build is standing in a blizzard in January, and the snow is sliding off the roof exactly the way you said it would slide. She was not a woman who said things like this aloud. She thought them in the private language of a person who has been alone for a long time and has learned that the most important conversations happen in the interior. She kept writing numbers. By 6 in the morning of January 19th, the exterior temperature had fallen to 38 degrees below zero. She read it through the 2-inch gap in the door with her eyes watering from the wind, and she pulled the door shut and wrote the number down and looked at it for a moment. 38 below. Inside 44 degrees with a fire that was running on coals and 2 hay bundles added in the last hour. The differential was 82 degrees. She had not known when she set the first post in July whether the structure would achieve an 82-degree differential in extreme conditions. Silas's notebook projected it. Emmett had believed it was possible, but projection and possibility were not the same as the number written in her own hand in the 6th notebook at 6 in the morning of January 19th, 1908. Emmett woke as the light was coming gray through the single intact window. He looked at the thermometer on the shelf. He looked at the notebook in her hand. He asked with the directness of a man who has no patience left for preamble what the outside number was. She told him. He was quiet for long enough that she counted the gusts against the cabin wall, 4 of them before he spoke. My house, he said, at its best, insulated in an ordinary winter, loses about a degree an hour with the fire banked. He paused. He looked at the thermometer. This room has lost 3 degrees in 12 hours with the fire running. She said nothing. He looked at the corridor door, the back door of the cabin that led into the covered walkway. Silas was right, Emmett said. He said it the way you say something that cost you something to say. Not because saying it was difficult, but because it was final, because it closed a question that had been open for 20 years. She went through the corridor to harvest. The snow against the corridor walls was piled high enough that the canvas bowed slightly inward on the windward side. But the bowing was within the tolerance the frame had been designed for Emmett's iron brackets, holding the load path true. The cellar hatch was clear. She went down the 23 steps and walked to the crates by lantern light. The carrots had continued growing through November and December, slow and steady in the 45-degree dark, the roots thickening in the loose dark soil until they were proper carrots. Real food, the kind of food that kept. She had harvested carefully, taking from the outer crates first and leaving the third crate to continue growing. Succession planting, the way Silas's notebook described, so that there was always something at each stage of development. She harvested enough for the day and climbed back up. She heard the first one on the 15th day of the storm. She had stopped counting days in the ordinary way by then. She counted them by the harvest record in the 6th notebook. One entry per day, the temperature and the yield and the fuel consumption. The log of a person keeping evidence of something that needed evidencing. The sound was footsteps on the path, not Emmett's footsteps, which she knew by the walking stick's rhythm. These were slower, irregular, the footsteps of someone moving through hip-deep snow without enough strength left to move through it efficiently. She was at the cabin door before the knock came. The woman standing on what had been the porch step was perhaps 35, though the cold and the hunger had done something to her face that made estimating her age difficult. She wore a coat that had been adequate for an ordinary January and was not adequate for this one. In her arms, wrapped in a blanket that had been good quality once and was now principally a memory of good quality, was a child of perhaps 18 months. The woman looked at Bea with the eyes of someone who has spent a long time arriving at a door and is not entirely sure they have the right to knock on it. She said 2 words. Please, just that. Bea stepped back and held the door open. She did not ask the woman's name. She did not ask how she had heard, or how she had managed 3 miles through blizzard drifts, or whether she had eaten anything in the last 2 days. She could see the answers to all of those questions in the woman's face and in the way she moved into the warmth of the cabin and stopped just inside the door as if she did not quite trust the warmth to be real. Bea put water on the stove. She went through the corridor and down the cellar steps and came back with carrots and 2 turnips she had been saving and the last of a small cabbage. She made soup in the largest pot she had, and while it heated, she cut bread from the loaf she had baked 3 days ago, and she put the bread and a jar of the preserves Willa Finch had brought in October on the table, and she said, "Sit down and eat." The woman sat. She ate with shaking hands, not hurrying, despite what her body must have wanted, the particular careful eating of someone who has been hungry long enough to know that eating too fast has its own consequences. The child accepted a piece of soft bread and held it with both hands and looked at the fire. Emmett watched from his chair. He did not speak. He watched the way he watched everything with the comprehensive attention of a man who is making a record of what he sees. When the woman had eaten, Bea packed a basket. Carrots, turnips, 2 loaves of bread, a jar of preserves. She wrapped it in the cleanest cloth she had and handed it across the table. The woman looked at the basket and then at Bea. "We heard you had food," the woman said. "Down in Alderton, they're saying that Voss woman on the ridge has food coming up out of the ground." Bea said, "Who told them?" "Roscoe Briggs," the woman said. "He was the first one to say it out loud. Said he'd seen it himself in October and hadn't believed it, but he'd seen it." She thought about Roscoe Briggs, who had given her 6 flour sacks for a basket of potatoes and laughed about milking a wolf. Roscoe Briggs, whose conversion had been economic and not moral, and who had apparently been telling people about the corridor whether he believed in it or not. She walked the woman to the edge of the clearing where the path south began, the snow packed hard enough that there from the wind to walk on rather than through. The woman turned once and said something that the wind carried away before it reached her. Then she turned again and went. Bea went back inside and made more soup. They came every day after that. Some came from the hollow directly below. Some came from the road families, the people whose claims sat along the valley floor, where the cold settled and stayed. Some came from Alderton itself, 7 miles east, which she would not have thought possible in these conditions. until she saw them arriving one and two at a time, moving through the drifts with the determination of people who had no remaining alternative to determination. She fed everyone. She did not count them as they came. She counted them afterward in the sixth notebook, a single mark for each person, a double mark for each child. By the end of the second week of the storm, the marks filled half a page. Roscoe Briggs came on the 12th day alone without his wife, which told her something about the state of things in Alderton. He stood in the doorway of the cabin and looked at Emmett in the chair, and at the soup on the stove, and at the corridor door. And then he looked at Bea with an expression she had not seen on his face before. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, "I'll be damned." She gave him soup and bread and a basket of vegetables for his wife. He sat at the table and ate and did not make any jokes about wolves or milking, and when he left, he paused at the door and said something she would remember for a long time. "Your husband," he said. "I thought he was a fool." His voice was flat and factual. "I said it to his face once back in about 1895. He looked at the corridor door. "I've been wrong about a fair number of things in my life. This is toward the top of the list." He went out into the snow. Willa Finch came on the 14th day. She arrived with her basket over her arm, the same basket she had carried to Bea's door in June, with the cornbread and preserves and her assessment that Bea would not survive to spring. She set the basket on the table. Inside were 6 eggs from her chickens, which had apparently survived the winter better than most livestock in the hollow. She sat at the table and accepted a bowl of soup and did not speak for a while. Then she said, "Your husband came to see me once back in about 1890, or thereabouts. Told me about the root cellar and the corridor and the whole plan. I told him it was foolishness and sent him home." She paused. "He came back the next year and told me again." She picked up her spoon. "He was a persistent man. He was B.S. said." Willa Finch ate her soup. Emmett watched from his chair and did not say anything, which was the right response, and he knew it. Dorothy Pruitt came on the 16th day. Bea saw her from the window before she reached the clearing, recognizable at a distance by her posture, which was the posture of a woman who has spent a lifetime holding herself in a particular way and does not know how to stop, even when the circumstances have removed every reason for it. Dorothy Pruitt was the wife of Judge Harlan Pruitt. She had been in the courtroom on the Tuesday in June when her husband read the will. She had laughed with the others, which Bea knew not because she had seen her specifically, but because Dorothy Pruitt was the kind of woman who set the social temperature of a room, and the room had been warm with laughter, which meant Dorothy Pruitt had laughed. She had told 3 people Bea had heard later through the particular information network of small valley communities that Silas Voss had clearly gone senile before he died, because leaving property to your own wife as if she were a stranger was the act of a man who no longer understood how things worked. She came into the clearing alone. Her husband was not with her. Her coat was good wool, better than anything Bea owned, and it was not enough for a January that had gone to 38 below. She stopped at the edge of the porch. She looked at Bea for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, "I am ashamed to be standing here." She said it quietly without drama. "I am ashamed of what I said about your husband and about you and about this place." She paused. "But my children have not eaten in 2 days, and I cannot afford my pride more than I can afford their hunger." Bea looked at her. There were things she could have said. She had the words for them, had been carrying them since June, since the courtroom, since the sound of laughter bouncing off wooden walls. She had earned the right to say them to this specific woman more than to almost anyone else in the valley. She stepped aside and held the door open. "Come in," she said. "There's soup on the stove." Dorothy Pruitt came inside. She sat in the chair Bea indicated and wrapped her hands around the bowl when it was placed in front of her, and she did not speak again until the bowl was empty. When she was done, she looked up. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. Bea packed a basket, carrots, turnips, bread, preserves. She handed it across the table. "You thank me by telling people what you saw." "Here," she said, "not for my sake." She paused. "Tell them what Silas built. Tell them his name." Dorothy Pruitt nodded. She picked up the basket and stood. At the door she turned, and what was in her face was something Bea recognized, the particular expression of a person who has revised a foundational belief and is still in the early stages of carrying the revision. She went out into the snow without saying anything more. Emmett from his chair watched the door close. He said Silas would have fed her too. "I know," Bea said. That was one of his qualities, Emmett said. He held no accounts. He paused, then coughed into his fist a long, wet sound that settled deep before it resolved. I used to think it was because he didn't notice when people were unkind to him. He shook his head slowly. It wasn't that. He noticed. He just didn't think the unkindness was the most important thing about them. Bea looked at the door where Dorothy Pruitt had gone. No, she said. He didn't. The storm broke on the 3rd of February. She knew it was breaking because the sound changed the way Silas's notebook said it would change, the sustained roar dropping to something that had spaces in it, silences between gusts that grew longer until the silences were the thing and the gusts were the interruption. By mid-morning, she could see the tree line from the window. Emmett was worse. He had been declining since the 20th of January, the cough taking more from him each day, the effort of breathing requiring a concentration that left him less for everything else. He slept most of the day now. He ate when she brought food and drank when she brought water, and spoke only briefly when he spoke at all, saving whatever reserves remained for the things that needed saying. On the evening of the 4th of February, he said, "I want you to know that I was wrong to stop listening to Silas when I did." She was sitting beside his chair. She said, "You listened when it mattered." He shook his head, a small motion that cost him something. "I stopped listening in about 1898 because I was tired of hearing about something that hadn't happened yet." He paused for breath. A man who keeps talking about what he's going to build when he should have built it 20 years ago. That's what I thought. He looked at the corridor door. "I was thinking about the wrong thing." "What were you thinking about?" she said. "Whether he would finish it," Emmett said, "when I should have been thinking about what he understood." He looked at her. He understood the earth. He understood that it holds what it holds regardless of what happens above it. He understood that if you can reach what the earth is holding, you never have to be cold, and you never have to starve, and winter stops being something that kills you. He stopped. He said, "That's not a small thing to understand." She found him in the morning of the 7th of February, in his chair beside the stove where he had been sleeping for the last 3 weeks. His hands were folded in his lap with the particular stillness of a body that has made its final arrangement. A bowl of carrot soup sat on the small table beside him, not quite empty, the last few spoonfuls grown cold in the night. His face was composed. The lines of effort that had deepened all winter were smoothed the way the landscape smooths after a long snow, everything reduced to its essential form. She sat with him for an hour before she went to tell anyone. She buried him on a rise behind the cabin in ground that had thawed enough to dig in the February sun. She carved the marker herself from a piece of oak left over from the quarter frame, the letters cut slowly and deliberately with a knife she sharpened 3 times in the process. Emmett Greer, she cut. And the years. And underneath the words that had come to her while she was digging. Builder of hope. She planted carrot seeds on the turned earth above him because he had eaten carrots from the cellar with the appetite of someone encountering a particular pleasure, and because the earth in that spot would hold its warmth through the spring, and because it seemed right that something should grow there. The tools he had brought stayed in the cabin. The knowledge he had given her stayed in everything she had built. Judge Harlan Pruitt came on the 10th of February. He came alone without his wife, without the authority of his bench, or his wool coat, or the wire-rimmed spectacles that had looked down at her over the top of a will in June. He came in a coat that had been fine once and had been through a hard winter, and he moved across the clearing with the careful steps of a man who knows he has come to do something difficult and has not allowed himself to turn back. He had an envelope in his hand. She saw it when he was still 20 feet away, a pale rectangle against the dark of his coat held in his right hand, with a care that suggested he had been holding it carefully for some time. She opened the door before he knocked. He stood on the porch step and looked at her and did not speak immediately, which she had not expected from him. He was a man who had always had his sentences prepared before he opened his mouth. But now he stood with his sentences apparently not prepared, or prepared and then abandoned. And what was left on his face was something simple and uncomfortable. "Mrs. Voss," he said. "Judge Pruitt," she said. He held out the envelope. She took it. The paper was old, the kind of age that comes from years in a drawer rather than years in the light. The envelope slightly yellowed and soft at the edges. Her name was written on the front. Not Beatrice, not Mrs. Voss, just B. In handwriting she would have known anywhere. She did not open it yet. She looked at Pruitt. He said Silas wrote that letter in the autumn of 1903. He brought it to my office personally and asked me to hold it and give it to you after he was gone. He looked at the clearing. I put it in the bottom drawer of my desk and I forgot about it. He paused. That's not entirely true. I forgot about it because I chose to forget about it because I thought the whole business was the last request of a man who had spent 30 years on a foolish project and was not in a position to make reasonable judgments about what should be done with his property. He stopped. She waited. I was wrong, he said. I have been wrong about your husband since approximately 1882, when I first heard him talk about the corridor at a town meeting and decided he had lost his sense of proportion. He looked at the corridor structure visible beyond the cabin's east corner, the canvas roof holding its position in the February light, the snow around its base, the only snow in the clearing that had been moved deliberately rather than blown there by accident. I was wrong and I kept being wrong, and I had 30 years of opportunity to reconsider, and I did not take any of them. He said this plainly without the hedging that characterizes a partial admission. He said it the way a man says something he has been preparing to say for a month. She looked at the envelope in her hand. She opened it. The letter was 3 pages, both sides of each, in Silas's careful handwriting. The script still controlled in 1903, though the effort behind the control was visible in how precisely each letter was formed, the handwriting of a man who knew his hands were not what they had been and was compensating. He did not begin with sentiment. He began with facts. He told her about the corridor, not the theory which he had explained many times in many ways over 30 years of explaining it to people who did not believe him. He told her about the results. He told her specifically and with numbers what he had observed in 30 winters of measurement. He told her about the lumber in the cellar cut and stored and ready waiting for someone with the time and the willingness to build what he had designed. He told her that the notebooks contained everything she would need. Then at the bottom of the second page, the handwriting changed slightly. Not in legibility, in quality. As if the mechanical production of letters had shifted into something less controlled and more direct. B, he wrote, I know what you have thought about this project and about me. I am not writing to argue with you. I am writing to tell you that I have put everything I knew and everything I understood into those notebooks, and I have stored the materials you will need, and if you choose to use them, you will find that the corridor works exactly as I have said. It works for 30 years. But I want to tell you something that is not in the notebooks. I built this for the valley. I built it because I understood what 38 below zero does to people in inadequate structures, and I wanted there to be an answer for that. But I also built it because I hoped that one day you would see what I had spent my life trying to build, and you would understand it, and you would know that I was not simply a man who had lost his way. I wanted you to see it. That was always part of what I was building. I love you. That is not in the notebooks either. She stood at the table in the February light and held the letter and did not try to manage what was happening in her face or in her chest because there was no one there to see it except Judge Pruitt. And Judge Pruitt had forfeited his right to her composure when he put this letter in a drawer in 1903. She stood there for a long time. Then she folded the letter carefully along its original lines and put it in the pocket of her coat against her chest, where she would keep it until the coat wore out. She looked at Judge Pruitt. He had the expression of a man waiting to be told what he deserved. I found what I needed, she said. She thought about the notebooks under the stone floor, the lumber stack against the cellar wall, Emmett Greer arriving in August with his walking stick and his 40 years of knowledge. I found it without the letter. She paused. But he deserved better than a drawer, she said. He deserves someone who listened. Judge Pruitt nodded. The nod of a man accepting a judgment that is accurate and fair and does not require elaboration. She looked at the corridor door. Come and see it, she said. She led him through the back of the cabin and into the corridor, and she watched his face as he registered the temperature, the stillness, the quality of the enclosed air. She led him to the cellar hatch and down the 23 steps and held the lantern so he could see the crates along the back wall, the green tops of the carrot plants still growing in February, the turnips in the second crate, the winter lettuce she had added in December that had surprised her by thriving. He stood in the cellar for a long time without speaking. Then he said, how many families? 37, she said, that she had counted in the notebook. And some she had not counted because she had not known they came until she found the evidence of it, the tracks in the snow, at the edge of the clearing, the small offerings left on the porch step, a jar of honey, a folded piece of cloth, a bundle of kindling from someone who had had kindling and nothing else to give. He said, I will tell people what I saw here. She said, tell them Silas Voss designed it. Tell them what 33 years of work looks like when someone finishes it. He looked at the carrot plants in the lantern light. Yes, he said, that is what I will tell them. The spring came the way spring always comes in the Virginia Highlands, apologetically at first, and then with conviction, the snow retreating from the south-facing slopes, while the north-facing hollows held on for another month, as if unwilling to admit that the argument was over. Ida Marsh's article ran in the Virginia State Agricultural Bulletin in March of 1908. Silas Voss's name appeared first in larger type, and the article was titled with a phrase from the fifth notebook that B had given Ida permission to use. Agricultural students came from the university in April to see the corridor, 4 of them carrying notebooks of their own, pressing their palms against the canvas walls and asking precise questions that told her they had read Ida's article carefully and understood what they were looking at. She answered every question. She showed them the notebooks, all 6 of them. Silas's 5 and her own 6th, and she let them read what they wanted to read. She showed them the junction bracing that Emmett had taught her, and she explained why the angle mattered and what it prevented. She showed them the canvas treatment and the base ties and the drainage that kept the post footings dry through wet springs. She charged nothing for any of it. My husband's work, she said when 2 of the students asked why she wasn't licensing the method. He spent 33 years developing it. It belongs to whoever can use it. The corridor grew over the years. By 1912, she had extended it to 40 feet and added a glass section where she had replaced the canvas with salvaged window glass from a collapsed church 3 miles south, the frames reset in the timber at an angle that let in winter light while holding the thermal envelope intact. By 1915, she had a second cellar chamber excavated off the main one, double the growing space with a dedicated area for the winter lettuce that had proved itself through 7 consecutive cold seasons. Roscoe Briggs sent customers to her. He sent them, without being asked, people who came into the store asking about building methods, about winter food storage, about what could actually be done with a root cellar if you connected it properly to the house above. He sent them up the ridge path with directions and a description of what they would find. And his description, she heard later, was straightforward. She built something that works, he told people. Her and her husband between them. Go see it. He never said more than that, but he never said less. Beatrice Voss died in the early morning of a Tuesday in March 1925, in the 81st year of her life, in the 18th year of the corridor's operation. The apple trees she had planted along the south slope of the ridge were just beginning to show the first swelling of buds, the particular moment before bloom, when the tree is making its decision about the season. The air had the smell of Virginia highlands, March mud and pine, and the cold, clean smell of late snow not yet finished, but already losing its conviction. She was found in the garden beside the corridor's south wall, kneeling at the edge of the raised bed she had built in 1910, her hands in the soil reaching toward a carrot sprout that had come up early in the protected warmth of the soil beside the corridor wall. Her granddaughter, who found her, said she looked peaceful, said she was facing the corridor toward the cellar end, said she was smiling. The corridor still stands behind the cabin on the Denton Hollow Ridge. It has been repaired and expanded and repaired again over the decades since Beatrice Voss died. The original oak posts are still in the ground, the same posts she dug the holes for in the Virginia clay with borrowed tools in the summer of 1907. Their bases preserved by the drainage system Emmett drew in the dirt that August afternoon. There is a plaque on the cellar door added in 1935 when the State Historical Society came out to document the structure. Silas Voss, the plaque reads, Beatrice Voss. And below both names, the words Silas wrote in the 5th notebook in the winter of 1903. The words Beatrice whispered to herself in the cellar light on the 24th of October. 1907, when the first carrot sprouts broke through the dark soil and proved that a dead man's 33 years of work had not been wasted, they will tell you nothing grows in the cold dark. They never kept a lantern inside. School groups come sometimes to press their palms against the old walls, to stand in the corridor and feel what it feels like when the wind is outside and you are not to go down the 23 steps, and hold their hands against the stone and feel the patient warmth that has been there since before Silas Voss bought the land in 1874 and will be there long after the plaque has weathered to illegibility. They feel what B felt on the first morning she descended into that cellar in June of 1907 with a lantern and a dead man's letter, and no reason yet to believe that anything in the world was going to work out. The earth holds its warmth, patient and constant year after year through blizzard and drought and the long, ordinary passage of seasons. We need only build the corridor to reach it. Silas Voss understood that. His wife finished what he started, and what they built together, one with 33 years of notebooks and one with a borrowed pickaxe and hands that learned what they needed to learn, is still standing on a ridge in the Virginia Highlands, doing exactly what it was always meant to do, holding the warmth,